So now we turn to homework exercise 20, our last homework exercise. And in this exercise, we're looking at disjunctive arguments. So with exercise 19, the instructions are similar. You're reading the argument in natural language, translating it into standard logical form for a disjunctive argument, then testing its validity. And that means, in particular, looking closely at how the second premise relates to the first premise, figuring out which disjunct it refers to, and then determining whether it affirms or denies a disjunct. So as we proceed, let's take a look at number 1. One of two things will happen. The president will veto the war funding bill, in which case the war will go on indefinitely, but without adequate supplies and weaponry. On the other hand, the Democrats will override the veto, causing a quick end to the war with disastrous geopolitical consequences in the Arab world for generations. But it appears the Democrats do not have the votes to override the veto, so it looks like we'll have a badly funded, longer war. So in this case, we start off with a somewhat complex argument, but we're looking first for the conclusion, and we find that as indicated here by the word so, that the conclusion is it looks like we'll have a badly funded, longer war. So setting that aside momentarily, we'll go back to look to discover the disjunctive argument. Of course, it's previewed by the sentence, one of two things will happen, and that can be a signal, for instance, on the quiz, that you're going to be dealing with a disjunctive argument. So what are the two choices here, or what are the disjuncts? The first one is the president will veto the war funding bill, and there are certain consequences that will result if that happens. And then we get the second disjunct, on the other hand, and the second disjunct is the Democrats override the veto, and, of course, consequences that will result from that action. So we have enough here to construct our disjunctive statement, and we would do that in standard form as either the president vetoes the bill or Democrats override the veto. And then the second premise tells us it appears the Democrats do not have the votes to override the veto. So that's clear enough. Democrats, or we would say no Democratic override. And that allows us to conclude with certainty that the president's veto will stand, and we'll get a badly funded, longer war as a result. And we can conclude that with certainty because this is a valid disjunctive argument. We know it's valid because we have a second premise here that refers to one of the disjuncts. It's the second disjunct, and indeed it denies that disjunct. So the disjunct is the Democrats override the veto, and the second premise is there is no Democratic override. So knowing that in a disjunctive statement, one of the disjuncts must be true, they both could be true, but they cannot both be false. If we know then by the second premise that one of them is false, we know the other one must be true, and that's why we are allowed to conclude with certainty that the president's veto is upheld, and indeed we end up with a badly funded, longer war. So it's a valid disjunctive argument. Number 2. He said the treatment would result in one of two side effects. Either the patient would experience nausea and headaches, or would simply break out in an itchy skin rash. The patient has the skin rash, so there's no chance of the nausea occurring. So in this instance, pretty clear example of a disjunctive statement. We have the either first disjunct, the patient experienced nausea and headaches, and then the second disjunct, or the skin rash. So we could translate that as either nausea and headaches or skin rash. And the second premise tells us the patient has the skin rash. However, that affirms that second disjunct. So this is an invalid argument because it commits the fallacy of affirming a disjunct. Number 3, she went to the diplomat with 2 options. The offending country could remove its personnel from the disputed territory, or she would order forced evacuation that would result in war. But thankfully, there'll be no war since the personnel were removed. So here in this natural language, we would first look for the conclusion. And in this case, the conclusion is there'll be no war. Since tells us that this is evidence. Since tells us the personnel were removed is the second premise. It's the evidence statement in the argument. So thankfully, the conclusion, there'll be no war. So now we're looking for the disjunctive statement that goes with that second premise. We know it's a disjunctive argument because we have here the 2 options preview, right? And so the disjuncts or the disjunctive statement would be, in standard form, either remove personnel or war, forced evacuation, and war. And then the second premise says personnel removed, right? However, this is an invalid argument again, and it's invalid because the second premise commits the fallacy of affirming a disjunct. That first disjunct is affirmed by the second premise. So we know when we have a disjunctive statement that one of the disjuncts must be true. They both could be true. And so knowing that one of them is true doesn't tell you anything about the other one. We must find out with the second premise that one of them is false, and then we can conclude with certainty that the remaining one is true. But in this case, the second premise tells us one of the disjuncts is true, which leaves us with no option to draw a certain conclusion regarding the second disjunct. So it's an invalid argument, fallacy of affirming a disjunct. Number 4. It is clear we have an administration on campus that is not only short-sighted, but also cares little about the environment, since they will apparently pave the wetlands and make a parking lot. They have 2 clear choices for addressing the parking problems. One is environmentally sound. The other is an assault on the local natural ecology. They could spend more on bus service to campus and thereby protect the campus wetlands and cut down on local air pollution. The alternative is to pave the wetlands and make more pollution by subsidizing individual automobile traffic. The latest university budget calls for a dramatic cut in the bus system budget. Therefore, the campus environment is doomed. So we have a rather complex argument here, a lot of different parts, some additional subclaims and clarifying information. And I kind of gave away there, I added in the therefore, but that tells us this last statement here, the campus environment is doomed, is the conclusion of the argument. And that's sort of reinforced in the opening sentence, which tells us the administration is short-sighted and cares little about the environment because they're going to pave the wetlands and make a parking lot, right? But we're looking here for the disjunctive argument, and the preview of the disjunctive comes here, 2 clear choices, right? One thing or the other. So one choice, on the one hand, we have it's a choice that's environmentally sound, and the other is an assault on the local natural ecology. Now, these are just descriptions of those choices and how they contrast with one another, but they aren't the choices themselves. Those are introduced in the next sentence. So we would translate that into standard disjunctive form as either we spend more money on bus service, and then the next sentence says, or, right, pave wetlands and make more pollution by subsidizing automobile traffic. Then the next sentence, or the next premise, tells us the latest university budget calls for a dramatic cut in the bus system budget, right? So we have no more money for bus service. That's the second premise. And as you look at this argument then, you have two disjuncts. Either we spend more money on bus service or we pave the wetlands and create more pollution by subsidizing automobile traffic. But the second premise tells us there will be no more money spent on bus service. Indeed, there'll be a budget cut for the bus system. So that second premise denies the first disjunct, making this a valid argument. Number 5, his decision to assign Cicero in Latin has left the class with two possible courses of action. They can either learn Latin so they can understand the assignment, or they can drop the class and be deprived of the opportunity of studying one of the great orators of history. The students, however, are inspired by Cicero's life and work and have dedicated themselves to learning Latin, so I guess they won't drop the class. So here in the natural language argument, we have a clear conclusion signaled by the argument indicator so. The students won't drop the class, that's the conclusion, but we'll set that aside. We're going to look for the disjunctive statement, and here it is signaled by either up here. Either they learn Latin so they can understand the assignment, or they drop the class. So we would translate that into standard disjunctive form as either learn Latin or drop the class, right? And then the second premise tells us the students are inspired by Cicero's life and work, and why wouldn't they be? And they've dedicated themselves to learning Latin. So students learn Latin is the second premise. However, as we look at this, we see that second premise affirms the first disjunct, making this an invalid argument because it commits the fallacy of affirming a disjunct. We cannot conclude then that the students won't drop the class. They could study Latin and then still drop the class, right? And that's why it's an invalid argument. Knowing that one of the disjuncts is true doesn't tell us anything about whether the other disjunct is true or false. Number 6, either more UNH faculty will increase their grading rigor, or the administration will be forced to further narrow the criteria for Latin honors and commencement awards, even though parents very much enjoy the awards ceremony. It appears the communication faculty are taking the threat of grade inflation seriously, and given the size of the communication major, it is likely they will start a general trend toward more rigorous grading across campus. This in turn will mean that the administration will not have to adjust the criteria for Latin honors and awards. So we have this natural language argument here, and we look for the conclusion signaled by this last sentence. This in turn will mean, and then here's the conclusion, administration will not have to adjust the criteria for Latin honors and awards. But how do we get there? We go back to the disjunctive statement signaled here by the logical operator either or. We have either more UNH faculty increase their grading rigor, or the administration will be forced to further narrow the criteria for Latin honors and commencement awards. Second premise is communication faculty are taking the threat of grade inflation seriously, and therefore it's likely they'll start a general trend toward more rigorous grading. So the stuff about the communication faculty is evidence in support of the second premise, and the second premise is it's likely there'll be a general trend toward more rigorous grading. So we would translate this into standard disjunctive form as either more rigorous grading, or alter the criteria for awards. Then the second premise tells us we're going to get more rigor in grading, right? And so can we conclude then that the administration will not have to adjust the criteria for Latin honors? And the answer to that question is no, we cannot conclude this because it's an invalid argument. And it's invalid because, once more, it commits the fallacy of affirming a disjunct. In this case, the first disjunct is affirmed, so we cannot conclude that the other disjunct is either true or false. Number 7. The negative advertising in the current national political campaign will keep voters away from the polls. Voters protest the degrading process of national elections by staying away from the polls, and they stay away either because of cynicism about politics or because of the negative tone of campaigning. However, many citizens actually participate in local public affairs, attending meetings, hearings, and local elections. There is no evidence of cynicism here, so it's the ads. So in this natural language commentary on national politics, we look first for the conclusion indicated by the so, and the conclusion is it's the ads. That is, in other words, it's the ads that are responsible for keeping voters away from the polls in national elections. And that conclusion is reached by a disjunctive argument. The disjunctive statement signaled here by the either because of cynicism about politics or because of the negative tone of campaigning. So we would translate that as either cynicism or negative ads. Either cynicism or negative ads being responsible for why people don't vote in national elections. Then the second premise tells us there is no evidence of cynicism. And what's the evidence to support the second premise is all of these things that people are doing on a local level. So here are examples of people participating in local politics. That's evidence of a lack of cynicism. And so the second premise, there is no cynicism, is supported by all of those examples. And then we can conclude with certainty then that it must be the ads, right? And we can conclude that with logical certainty because it is a valid disjunctive argument. The argument is valid because the second premise denies the first disjunct. Then finally, number 8. Now here we have a fairly complex argument, and perhaps even more complex than merely a disjunctive argument. So as we see, we'll interpret this here and analyze it. You'll see there's actually 2 different arguments going on. If we don't act now to save Social Security, then there'll be no benefits when those now working reach retirement age. Either we implement means testing, withholding benefits from those who are wealthy and raise the retirement age to 70, or we raise Social Security taxes. No politician wants to raise any taxes, so that option is just not going to happen. It seems the only solution is to raise the age and implement means testing. However, Congress shows no signs of doing anything to fix Social Security, so I'm very pessimistic about the availability of benefits when we who are working now retire. So you may have already recognized we have both a conditional argument and a disjunctive argument. We have the conditional statement: if we don't act to save Social Security, then there'll be no benefits when those who are now working reach retirement age. We also have a disjunctive statement: either we implement means testing, withholding benefits, or we raise Social Security taxes, okay? So let's actually construct both of these arguments into standard logical form. So we start with the conditional statement: if no action then no benefits. There's a efficient abbreviation of that conditional statement. If there's no action on Social Security, then there'll be no benefits for those who are working now. And then we also have a disjunctive statement, either implement means testing and raise the age. We have a double or complex disjunct, or raise taxes. So then we move on in the argument, and we see that no politician wants to raise taxes, so that option is not going to happen. So if we go back to the disjunctive statement, we see that we get in the next statement in the argument a denial of the second disjunct. So no taxes raised, right? Because no politician wants to raise any taxes, that option is not going to happen. It seems the only solution is to raise the retirement age and implement means testing, right? So there's the conclusion. So the only way to fix Social Security then is to raise the age and implement means testing. Okay, so that is a valid disjunctive argument. And the valid disjunctive argument, we know it's valid because we have the second premise, which denies the second disjunct. So this conclusion of the disjunctive argument is for certain true. Now we take this statement, which functions as the conclusion of the disjunctive argument, and we return to the conditional argument that we've begun to construct over here. So in this instance, we have if no action, then no benefits. So the question is, are we going to get any action on Social Security by Congress? That is Congress going to implement means testing and raise the age in Social Security? So even though it seems the only solution is to raise the age and implement means testing, Congress shows no signs of doing anything to fix Social Security. So there'll be no action of any kind on Social Security. And that second premise affirms the antecedent of the conditional statement. So this also is a valid conditional argument, and we know it's valid because we get a valid form, the second premise affirming the antecedent. So we can then conclude that there'll be no benefits for anyone who is working now and who needs to retire in a few years. So we have two arguments going on, two different types of molecular argument. We have the conditional argument and the disjunctive argument, and both the conditional and the disjunctive arguments are valid. So there's a review of disjunctive arguments with a little bit of extra complexity thrown in on number 8. And again, you will get some of these on the quiz. They'll be mixed up with the conditionals, so you'll have a section just on molecular arguments, and you'll need to determine the type of argument before you test for validity. Look for the clues in the natural language, which help you figure out the parts of the argument and which help you determine the relationship of the two premises, the molecular statement and the second premise. And it's always that relationship between the second premise and the molecular statement that helps you determine whether a molecular argument is valid or invalid. So if you have any questions on disjunctive arguments or on conditionals, please post them to the discussion board.